Hello and welcome to Where the Bush is Burning. I'm your host, Tom Tice, and each week we gather together and have a conversation about Christ. We're going to do that again today. If you recall from last week, if you saw last week's video, we talked about who does Christ call. And today we're going to zero in on one particular incident where we see the evidence of the compassion of Christ for someone whom other people would have shunned or other people would have considered to be a marginalized individual, someone who was struggling with various issues that caused self-harm. And so we're going to be spending some time today having a conversation about Christ and his compassion for this particular individual. And it follows well in line with the conversation that we had last week. Now, the incident that I'm going to read to you out of the scriptures occurs in more than one of the Gospels. It occurs in Matthew and Mark and Luke, but there are some particular details that Mark brings out that I want us to consider. So we're going to go to that passage of scripture. We're going to read it. It is a little longer than what we normally read, but it's worth it in order for us to gain the context. So if we turn to Mark, and in Mark chapter 5, we find these words. Then they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gadarenes, and when he had come out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit, who had his dwelling among the tombs, and no one could bind him, not even with chains, because he had often been bound with chains, shackles and chains. The chains had been pulled apart by him and the shackles broken in pieces. Neither could anyone tame him. And always, night and day, he was in the mountains and in the tombs, crying out and cutting himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and worshipped him, and he cried out with a loud voice and said, "What have I to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I implore you by God that you do not torment me." For he said to him, "Come out of the man, unclean spirit." Then he asked him, "What is your name?" And he answered, saying, "My name is Legion, for we are many." Also he begged him earnestly that he would not send them out of the country. Now a large herd of swine was feeding there near the mountains. So all the demons begged him, saying, "Send us to the swine, that we may enter them." And at once Jesus gave them permission. Then the unclean spirits went out and entered the swine. There were about 2,000, and the herd ran violently down the steep place into the sea and drowned in the sea. So those who fed the swine fled, and when they had told it in the country, and they told it in the country and in the city and in the country, and they went out to see what it was that had happened. Then they came to Jesus and saw the one who had been demon-possessed and had had the legion sitting and clothed and in his right mind. They were afraid, and those who saw it told them how it happened to him who had been demon-possessed and about the swine. Then they began to plead with him to depart from their region. And when he had got into the boat, he who had been demon-possessed begged him that he might be with him. However, Jesus did not permit him, but said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them what great things the Lord hath done for you, and how he has had compassion on you." And he departed and began to proclaim in Decapolis all that Jesus had done for him, and all marveled. So that's the end of that account as we find Mark gives it to us. So in this incident, we have a couple of things that are really worthy of our consideration. Now, there's a number of elements to this discussion. We could get into a lot of different areas. I may refer to them obliquely, but there are two or three things about this that I believe are very much worth our time as we have a conversation about Christ. The most outstanding thing to me in regard to this is the compassion which Christ evidenced. And he references that there at the end of the passage of Scripture as he's talking to the man. Christ crosses over the Sea of Galilee, goes into this area called Gadara or the Gergesenes. You find it referred to in various ways. You can find it on a map if you want to locate it. It's called the Decapolis area, the 10 cities. That's what Decapolis means. And so Christ intentionally goes into this area. And he goes there apparently with the intention of meeting this particular individual. Now, Matthew tells a story slightly differently. Luke tells a story a little differently. The substance of it is this: as Christ gets to the shore of the Sea of Galilee, gets out of the boat, this person, and Matthew says there's two, but in this particular case, Mark talks about the primary individual under consideration. And he says that this person comes out to meet him. Now, Mark identifies him as being demon-possessed. There's this whole discussion of how did this person get here? How was it that he had become demon-possessed, and all the interaction that goes on between Christ and talking to the demons and sending the demons away and them going into the swine. There's a lot of things that can be said about that. There's been a lot of discussion, a lot of ink spilled, and a lot of opinions expressed. Here's what I think we ought to concentrate on. However this individual got to where he was, here was the result. He was experiencing extreme mental health issues. The extreme mental health issues that he was experiencing ostracized him from regular society. It meant that he was in a de facto way harming himself, and that regularly he was crying aloud, he was cutting himself with stones. He was not at that point wearing clothes. Other passages of Scripture describe him as being naked. They had tried to restrain him forcibly. They had chained him. They had shackled him. None of that had been of any avail. This was a person who was experiencing extreme distress. That was the result of his condition. Now, we can have a discussion about demon possession and all the rest of it, but that will have to wait for another day. What I want to concentrate on today in this conversation about Christ is the fact that this person was doing himself great harm. He was experiencing extreme mental anguish. He was harming himself. He was struggling mightily. Now then, remember last week we talked about the fact that the people whom Christ calls are not the wise, not the mighty. They are the people who are, in many respects, the marginalized. They are not the people whom we consider necessarily to be great candidates for grace. God does not reckon as we do. God does not consider as we do. God does not view things as we do. And it's important for us to learn to view things as he does and to learn to view people as he does. Now, however this individual arrived at this condition, here was his condition. He was unclothed. He was experiencing extreme mental anguish. He was distressed. He was self-harming, cutting himself with stones. Christ addresses him, and then in the course of the next few moments, as they have this interaction, Christ deals with the issue that he has. Now, as Mark describes it, it's demon possession. Other people have expressed other opinions about it. However, this is the story that Mark is telling. This is the same or a similar story as what Matthew and Luke tell. And Christ addresses the issue that the man is having, and he sees the man as being of value, sees the man as being important, sees the man as being one to whom he can do good and whom he can elevate. And so he addresses the situation. Now, in the way in which Mark tells it, he sends the demons away, they go into a herd of swine, the swine run into the sea. There's all that's part of this story. However, what I want you to see is the compassion that Christ demonstrates toward this individual. Regardless of how he got there, he demonstrates compassion toward him. He addresses the man, addresses the issue, deals with the issue, and delivers the man. as the result of that, and as the result of the fact that Christ addresses the issues that he has, deals with those issues, he then brings him to the place where he is at the end seated, which he had not been before. He was running about, screaming, terrorizing the neighborhood. He is now seated, he is clothed, and he is in his right mind. So he is bringing his self-harm to an end. He is bringing his aberrant behavior to an end. He is demonstrating compassion towards this person who was, by all accounts, a very tortured individual. This is what Christ does. This is the compassion that he demonstrates. This is the end result of that. So it's important for us to see Christ as he sees this individual and demonstrates compassion upon him. The reason it becomes useful to us in many respects is this. We encounter people constantly in various contexts who are in various ways perhaps harming themselves. Now, the ways in which they may be harming themselves may be more obvious or less obvious to us. In this particular context, obviously the man was doing things to himself that were very, very clearly self-harming. The cutting himself with stones, the self-mutilation, the torment that he was expressing, the running about without clothing. All these things were indicative of the kind of torture under which he was suffering. Christ saw the person. Christ saw him in his most chaotic state as a human being. And Christ demonstrates his compassion towards this individual in such a remarkable way that it changes his life. The reason we should find this useful is because, first of all, we could recognize that an individual encountering Christ will be changed. An encounter of Christ that we would have will address the issues that we have in our lives. And all of us have some sort of issues. Now, we may not recognize them as clearly in ourselves as other people would recognize them in us, or we may know and understand that we are suffering greatly as a result of various things, and various circumstances and conditions can cause us to have great mental anguish, great mental distress. We may even find ourselves in the position of being self-harming. And so we need something to change how we are doing. We need something to change our lives. We need something to make a difference so that we improve and our life is transformed from where we are to where we need to be and to become healthy individuals in mind and in body, physically, mentally, spiritually, and socially. These are all things that are important. And so when we encounter Christ, Christ addresses these circumstances. Now, in this particular instance, he addressed the incidents that this man was engaged in, or he addressed the condition that this man had very directly and very quickly. He addressed it instantaneously. In a very brief period of time, this man's life was totally transformed. Does he always address it that way with everyone? Well, no, he does not. He does things in his own time. And in this particular case, I believe probably because this situation was so dire, this man's condition was so horrific, that Christ addressed it, and within just a short space of time, this man's life was ultimately transformed. He began to be in his right mind. He began to have clothing, wear clothing, sit down, have a conversation that was a reasonable conversation, express his desires, for example, to be with Christ. And so Christ did a remarkable thing in his life in a very short space of time. Will he do that in everyone's life that he encounters in that amount of time? No, he will not. He has his own time for how he deals with us. There are many things that he addresses that take years, literally years, to rectify. However, what we do want to see here is how compassionate Christ is. We want to see how kind, how gracious, how much he centers on this individual who was one of the most marginalized of individuals. His condition would have been such that it put him apart from the rest of society. It would have isolated him. It would have imprisoned him, if you will, in his own mind and in his own soul. So here was an individual who was under extreme duress at this point, and it marginalized him completely from the rest of the society in which he was living. Christ addressed it, demonstrated a high degree of compassion, rectified the issues that were most pressing in this man's life, and then said to the man, now go back to your family, go to your friends, go to the people that you know, tell them how great things that the Lord has done for you and how he's had compassion on you. Well, this is the Christ I want to commend to you. This is the Christ who has compassion on the self-harming, has compassion on the person who's marginalized, has compassion on the person who has been isolated by the things that have afflicted them, whatever those things are and however they have had those things happen to them. So therefore, we see Christ exercising extreme compassion in this particular case and transforming this individual's life. Will Christ do that for us? Yes, he will. I can certainly attest to the transformation that he has made in my life. I can testify to the issues that he's addressed that have caused me great torment and grief and hardship. And so I can personally testify that these are things that he's done for me. Do I know other people to whom Christ has been compassionate and people whose lives he has changed? Yes, I could point you to a number of people that I've encountered over the course of the last 50 years who all of whom had difficulties of one stripe or variety or another. They may not have been as extreme as this man's issues were. However, they were genuine issues, and they were issues that caused them mental anguish, caused them, in some cases, self-harm, caused them, in some cases, to be marginalized from society and to not have social contact in a normal sense with other people. So, and all of these people that I could point you to are people to whom Christ has been compassionate and in whose lives Christ has made a difference. So I commend to you the overwhelmingly compassionate Christ who calls people like this unto himself, who does great things for them and has compassion upon them. So I would commend this Christ to you today. Now, I can't know what your life is any more than you can know what my life is. You can't know the things that I've experienced, and I can't know all the things that you've experienced. However, what I can do is this: I can point you to Christ, because Christ will address the issues in your life that are causing you the most distress. He will address the issues in your life that are causing you the most anguish and perhaps even causing you to do yourself harm. So I commend this Christ to you. And I want you to see in this particular instance where he demonstrates a high degree of compassion towards this individual who is self-harming, who needs compassion, who needs transformation of life, who has huge issues that need to be addressed, and Christ addresses those issues and does him good. And that's what we know about Christ, is that he went about doing good. And in this particular context, here is an individual under great duress, suffering anguish, and even to the extent of self-harm. Christ addresses that, shows compassion to him, and causes his life to be ultimately transformed. If he could do that for that man, then he can do that for you. He can do that for me and has done those things for me. And I can, as I say, testify to others to whom he has been compassionate and upon whom he has had compassion and whose lives he has ultimately transformed. That's our conversation today. I hope that it's useful to you. I trust that you, if you have not embraced Christ, will do so as the gospel offers him. I hope that this is an encouragement to you. I hope it also causes you to think about those people whom you know who may also be self-harming, who may be people who are suffering great anguish, mentally, physically, socially, spiritually, and that you will demonstrate to them the likeness to Christ that is that compassionate likeness, and consider them, because Christ did not disdain to minister to a congregation of one. He selected this man, ministered to him, demonstrated compassion, changed his life. What Christ has done for others, he will do for us. That's our conversation today. This is Where the Bush is Burning. I am your host, Tom Tice. Please feel free to respond. I appreciate those of you who have been responding, and I trust that the Lord will encourage you in the things of God. Christ is for you. And if you are blessed by what we're doing here, you enjoy this, please like it and subscribe. That would be lovely. We would appreciate that entirely. Now, we also produce a devotional called Where the Bush is Burning. You may find it at hopeharbor.church. That's hopeharbor.church. Also, once a week, we put up a audio message that you can hear, which is a message from Hope Harbor. And then also, please feel free to join us on any other occasion. Make use of these videos for the purpose for which they're intended, which is to encourage you in the things of God and to point you to Christ. Thank you very much for joining us today. Join us again on another occasion here at Where the Bush is Burning.